Hi, I'm Brad Barham, a University of Wisconsin-Madison professor. I teach and conduct research on economic and environmental issues in the United States and Latin America. I focus on the intersection of agriculture and sustainable development.
This video examines the weird economics of water in cities served by the Colorado River system, discussing what water agencies everywhere call municipal and industrial, or M&I use. In this video, we introduce 5 weird observations that we can then explain with some economic concepts and comparisons across the region. Briefly, these observations are: 1. Most urban residents who rely on the Colorado River live far from it and may have never seen it. 2. Prices of water can vary by 7 to 1 across major metropolitan areas in the Southwest, and prices of water can vary by 100 to 1 between rural and urban residents in the Southwest. Urban areas with more diverse, resilient sources face higher prices so far. And then finally, urban water usage varies a lot across major metropolitan areas, with higher price areas having lower usage rates. Economists would expect that. By examining the economic logic of these weird observations about urban or M&I water, we can begin to look for solutions to the Colorado River crisis of too much water use relative to the water available. More so than most of the other videos, we use some basic economic graphs to illustrate the link between agricultural and water outcomes. We also explain how municipal water pricing works and how these prices affect the use patterns across the Colorado River Basin. All of these weird economics ideas are shared in words and with comparisons across cities, so don't let the fear of graphs stop you from watching this or any other video in this series. It helps to start by recognizing that while urban consumption accounts for about 25% of total water use in the Colorado River system, it supports about 40 million people across the Southwest. Most of those live in large metropolitan areas where population growth took off in the last 40 years. As just mentioned, our first weird observation is that most urban residents actually live a pretty long distance from the Colorado River. Many of them may never have actually seen the river that sustains their lives and communities. This may limit consumer awareness of what the Colorado River crisis means to the environment and our relationship to the water sources that sustain us. Let us consider 3 examples. First, the Denver metropolitan area has about 3 million people. It gets its Colorado River water through mountain tunnels that deliver the water from the Rockies, which lie to the west. If you add in the other Eastern Front Colorado cities like Fort Collins and Boulder, about 4.5 million residents rely on the Colorado River for water. In Los Angeles and San Diego, those 2 metropolitan areas have about 16 million people combined. These 2 regions get their Colorado River water from aqueducts and pipelines that deliver the water across the Mojave Desert, almost 300 miles from the border of Arizona and California to these coastal cities. And then there are Phoenix and Tucson. These metropolitan areas get their Colorado River water from the Central Arizona Water Project that delivers the water 200 miles to the southeast from the same California-Arizona border. The Phoenix metropolitan area has 5 million people, Tucson a little more than 1 million. So these 5 metropolitan areas I just mentioned account for about 2/3 of the population in the Colorado River Basin, and none of them are geographically close to the river.
Our next weird economics observation is that prices of water to urban consumers can vary by almost 7 to 1 across the basin.
Salt Lake City residents in Utah as a whole have the lowest costs for 150 gallons of water per day, about $45 per household per month, as compared to 180 to 200 in Los Angeles and San Diego, and almost 300 in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And if you look at the table, I've put them in 2 tiers, the one I call below 75 and the other the above 140 tier, with Tucson, Los Angeles, San Diego, and Santa Fe in the upper, and Salt Lake, Denver, Phoenix, and Las Vegas in the lower.
Our third weird observation is that the price gaps between urban use in some rural cities and major urban areas can be even larger.
The urban water price for residents in San Diego County is about 120 times what it is in the Imperial Valley for urban residents. 100 miles apart and about 100 times the price. But the basic story is that some rural residents get their Colorado River water at the same low prices that farmers in their region do, based on senior rights of the area and paying only the cost of conveying the water. This is another weird observation that we will explain in more detail soon, but basically if water is coming from recycling, desalination, or other alternative sources, it is likely to be more expensive than if it comes from surface water, especially if it's directly from the nearby Colorado River. Not surprisingly, urban water use rates in some areas where prices are high, are much lower than those in urban areas where prices are low. In other words, Santa Fe and San Diego have low water use rates at about 70 to 90 gallons per day per household versus around 200 per day in Utah. Now, while some people argue about the measures of water use, there is a clear pattern of higher use rates in lower price areas and lower use rates in higher price areas. So to review, we have 5 observations. First, most urban water consumers in the Southwest live far from the Colorado River. Second, prices of water for urban consumers can vary by 7 to 1 across the major metropolitan areas, and they break up into these 2 tiers. 3, prices can vary by more than 100 to 1 between rural city residents and those who live in large metropolitan areas that may not be far away, at least as the crow flies. And then 4, more diverse sources of water and therefore more resilient supplies actually tend to mean higher prices so far or for now, and this could change in the years ahead. And finally, water usage rates vary considerably across the region, and they are inverse to prices. Where you have high prices, you have low use rates. Where you have low prices, you have high use rates. That's not weird. Economists would expect that. It's time for some economic models and some institutional explanations that help to explain why markets don't do more work to close price gaps and improve water allocation across cities and regions of the Colorado River Basin. We start by presenting a graph that relates agricultural and urban water use rates. This graph depicts 2 regions, a rural or agricultural region and an urban region. In this graph, there is a fixed amount of water, and that's measured along the horizontal axis, the length OW, and based on water rights, the agricultural region has access to a fixed quantity of water or supply. That is denoted by the vertical supply line S. The demand for water in the agricultural area is denoted by a downward sloping demand curve, DR, and agricultural or rural users will use WW prime, or most of the water that is available, and they'll do so at a price level denoted by P rural. The remaining water, OW prime, is then sold to the urban area at a higher price, denoted by P urban, where the supply curve hits their demand curve, DU. It is a guaranteed amount to agricultural users based on their senior water rights that determines the large quantity they receive at a low price, and the reverse for urban users. If markets allocated the water, the price would be P star everywhere, and rural users would get less water at a higher price, and urban users would get more water at a lower price.
This graph explains the big price gaps between the low prices paid by farmers and some rural residents in irrigation districts with senior rights and urban residents elsewhere. While we don't explain why here in this graph, it also suggests why there might be big efficiency losses, because some water is being used probably for water-intensive crops at a very low price, while consumers in the city are paying much higher prices for water that's restricting their use.
A second key factor that shapes variations in water prices and access to water is the cost of conveyance of the water. All along the river, water agencies have to justify their water prices to consumers based on conveyance costs, usually from their main channels of the Colorado River or other surface waters that they deliver to consumers. Pricing regulation for public utilities is based on the costs of the water plus a premium to generate earnings that can be reinvested in infrastructure and efforts to secure water. This conveyance cost driver means that the further the water has to go to get to consumers, the more likely it is to cost them more. San Diego residents sit at the end of the pipeline from the Arizona-California border, and so their conveyance costs are greater than, say, residents in Brawley, California or Riverside, California. The same is true for Tucson versus Phoenix. Tucson is further away from the Central Arizona Project canals that bring Colorado River water to both cities, and this helps to explain some of the price gap for consumers between the 2 cities that favor Phoenix. While we're talking about water prices, it helps to add that efforts to diversify water supplies, including recycling of water in an effort to build resilience to droughts or Colorado River shortages like we're facing now, can be another explanation for higher prices. The point is that water costs shape prices beyond conveyance. Senior rights in rural areas keep prices tied to conveyance, which can keep water prices down. Urban areas that mostly pay just for the conveyance of water can also have lower rates. But once water utility agencies start adding in other sources, especially the recycling of water or desalination plants, to build more resilient water supplies for their customers, prices of water will tend to go up. Then they may have no choice. Most of Israel's water comes from desalination. Likewise for other cities around the Middle East or the world with little available surface water. So basically there are 4 water sources that may be available to water agencies in the Southwest. There are surface waters that include the Colorado River, groundwater from aquifers, those are very important in Phoenix, for example, recycled water, sometimes pumped into aquifers for storage, dilution, and to help with recharge, and desalinated water that's really only available directly in California and perhaps southern Arizona. In the case of the Colorado River region, only other surface waters and some groundwater can be comparable in cost or perhaps less than Colorado River water cost. The other 2 can be upwards of 100 times the conveyance cost of water along the river. Thus, as San Diego added desalination and recycling plants to their water system to build reliability and resilience into their water delivery, they have also added in higher cost supplies, which have helped to push up what San Diego residents pay relative to other urban residents in the Southwest. Think of it this way. Some of San Diego's water comes from relatively cheap sources, about half from the Colorado River, and the rest of it is more expensive as it's secured from other costly sources. And even the water coming from the Colorado River is not really directly San Diego's. Most of it is coming from other conservation investments they've made that they've undertaken with local irrigation districts there, the Coachella and the Imperial Irrigation District. And they pay those districts more per unit water than if they were just paying for the conveyance costs of the water. If we look at water sources across the basin, Denver, Los Angeles, and San Diego get at least half of their water from the Colorado River in one way or another. Phoenix gets about 1/3 as they rely more on groundwater and surface waters coming from the mountains to the north. One more factor shapes the price of water in urban areas: how the utilities price water based on the amount that consumers use. Some charge a flat rate, but most have some version of what's called inverted pricing, where the price goes up as you use more. The graph shows the 3 basic options for pricing water or other utilities. Uniform pricing keeps the price the same no matter how much is consumed. Declining block pricing actually lowers the price based on more volume used. This is rarely used in water markets. Third, inverted pricing schemes, the bottom one on the graph, that's the one to focus on, and it means that the more you consume, the higher you pay per unit water, and these usually tend to go up over intervals. The next slide shows San Diego's inverted price scheme. Consumers pay a monthly base fee. Then as their consumption goes up, they pay different rates for the water. Up to 400 cubic feet, they pay $5.42. And then notice how the price unit goes up by about 10% and then 40% for the succeeding intervals. Denver bases their tiers for the inverted block pricing on much larger intervals, and the increase between the second and third tier is not as steep as for San Diego, which means they penalize overuse less than in San Diego. Overall, in terms of inverted pricing schemes, San Diego and Santa Fe, not shown immediately here, as well as Tucson, have significant tiered pricing schemes. Denver, Los Angeles, and Las Vegas a bit less. Phoenix and Salt Lake City tend to use a flat rate charge that varies across seasons. And then Salt Lake City actually has the lowest prices of the major urban areas, except for St. George, which you can see below them. So far we've examined all the main factors that lead to significant price variations across urban areas, but we've not yet linked this price variation to different use rates or consumption in the region. The 2 charts used next are indicative of rates of urban water use across the region, but they're not exact or up to date. So notice in the state comparisons that California is much lower at around 80 gallons per person compared to Utah at the upper end at about 175 per person. And Nevada, Colorado, and Arizona are in between these extremes around 125 gallons per person. The next chart includes some southwestern cities with Los Angeles, Tucson, and Phoenix down toward the bottom, and St. George, Utah at the top with nearly 2.5 times the average daily use of the other areas. So if we put the pricing levels and use levels together, here's what we get. Cities with the lowest prices, like in Utah, have the highest water use rates, and cities with the highest prices, like in San Diego, Santa Fe, and Tucson, they have the lowest water use rates. High prices, more conservation; low prices, less conservation. That's simple economics. But here comes a surprise conclusion to the water story in urban areas. Most urban areas in the Southwest have been reducing their water consumption levels for the past 2 decades. As some analysts put it, population and water use has become decoupled because the use rates for water dropped that rapidly. Let's look at 2 examples again, San Diego and Tucson. In San Diego County, which includes some rural and agricultural areas, per capita water use declined by 80 gallons per person since 2000, from 216 gallons per day down to 134 per day. Among residents of the city of San Diego, it's now less than 80 gallons per day. In the city of Tucson, it has declined from around 115 gallons per day in 2000 to around 80 gallons per day in 2020. Water conservation measures linked to higher prices have worked in both of these cities to dramatically reduce water use. Ironically, there can even be a weird twist to this situation. Higher prices that lead to conservation can also perversely lead to even higher prices, as water utilities have to cover their costs by raising prices further to make up for consumption reductions. This negative feedback loop can lead to consumer pushback on investments in conservation like water recycling, because while these investments improve the reliability of water supplies, they can often raise rates in kind of a vicious cycle of higher rates to cover the costs of reduced consumption that people undertake. So while reductions in use would be great for the Colorado River system by reducing the overall demand for the water, it may not feel that good to local consumers who are paying higher prices as they reduce their water use. Okay, let's conclude. First, many urban areas like San Diego and Tucson are paying high prices for water, ranging from 7 times what other urban areas pay to over 100 times what some rural residents pay. 2, beyond the cost of conveyance, multiple factors influence the urban water prices, including investments in conservation or water supply enhancement. But pricing plans can also matter, and they affect behavior, and they are used by local water agencies. Particularly, inverted price structures are used throughout much of the region, but to different degrees and with distinct effects. Simply put, on this front, there's more to be done with raising prices for residential water use, especially to reduce water used outside of the house for landscaping and lawns. We'll talk more about this issue in one of the policy videos, but the higher prices for higher water use could be targeted to that end. Make it expensive to water lawns and other water-hungry outdoor uses like pools, golf courses, and so on.